session today is about succession, which I can tell by the number of people in the room is something that a lot of people are very interested in. So what I want to do is get the ball rolling, because we have three, we're very fortunate because we have three sort of different perspectives, I think, different perspectives with common threads to the idea of succession and how we resolve this. We all know that it's a very vexed subject, and the last speaker was talking about the issue of keeping farms in families and keeping small farms going, and how we do that, what are the mechanisms by which we do that in the face of, you know, the increasing corporatisation. All issues around land ownership are very complex and vexed. So I would like to start by offering or giving you all the chance, or inviting you to give me your sort of stories or your perspectives on succession, where you're at in this process yourself, and then we can kind of dig into some of the details. So Josh Gilbertson, Tanya Massy, Jim Phillipson, Gilbert, sorry. I have a son called Gilbert, so I kind of, if I start sort of lecturing you, you'll know why. Anyway, so we have, these guys can speak for themselves, but fascinating stories from each of them, and very interesting perspectives. So Josh, why don't you start?
Yeah, thank you. And I'd like to start by acknowledging country and paying my respects to elders past and present on these lands, and thank them for their contribution of protecting this beautiful landscape. And I also want to acknowledge my elders. I'm a Warramai man. I live on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and I think it's some of the most beautiful country. It's pretty good too, but it's pretty nice where I am. And yeah, just want to thank my elders past and present up there as well. We've been farming Warramai country for 60,000 years, and I purposefully use the word farming because I think the narrative around hunter-gatherers, similar to Uncle Bruce's work, and thanks Jack for your work as well, Bros, it is limiting and creates a narrative that our people are kept in time, that we are cultural beings that are only capable of pre-colonial aspects. So we've been farming for 60,000 years. 200 years ago this year, the biggest agricultural company in Australia today got gifted 1 million acres of our landscape and came in and colonised our people. Coincidentally, at the same time, my family married in to some of the company members. And I think my story around agriculture, despite having this 60,000 year narrative, is also very similar to a lot of the people here. That we've been farming for 200 years, Western livestock alongside, you know, Indigenous cultural rights, and also, you know, this new Western understanding of what agriculture is. So I think for me that transformation, that cultural adaptation to new agricultural systems has been an important aspect around how we think about where we are in our landscape and what that means. But because 1 million acres of our land got gifted to the Australian Agricultural Company, that means that succession is a very touchy subject in our family. But we hold a lot of the values I think you'll hear. We have a connection to country that still means a lot to us, that we want to be on this landscape for not just the next 200 years, but the next 60,000 years. That we're committed to being on our land for such a long period of time, in whatever way that looks, and making sure that we're adapting to whatever economic situation, whatever environmental changes, and whatever agricultural changes happen. I've also got, and I guess my skin colour is a reminder that I've also got some white ancestry in me, and my white family is where all of our agricultural money has come from, definitely not the black side. So, you know, on my dad's side, you know, generational farmers in terms of beef cattle production and dairy, the same on my mum's side. And I think that legacy piece is really important, that not only just for keeping their legacy, their dreams and their aspirations alive, but seeing that broader 60,000 year horizon back. So it's a common effort. I often think that it's a massive responsibility, and I see myself as a linchpin in that conversation, that whatever we can do now to just get that baseline up the next level is a massive opportunity. I also wanted to note, I think it's a privilege that we get this conversation, that despite 200 years of colonization, people are in a position now where they can talk about what they do with their land, their owned land in its various forms, and that you can still do that in an economy that has not favoured Indigenous people through that process. And I had a look at the stats this morning because I was really interested. An Indigenous person is 3 times less likely to own a house in a regional town than a non-Indigenous person. So it's a privilege to have these conversations, and I think if we start from that perspective, if we think about the legacy and the value, then I think we end up with a very nuanced conversation going forward.
Hard act to follow, Josh. Lovely to be here with you all. So I'm from a multi-generational family farm on Garigo country in southeast New South Wales, and in recent years we've been really facing into the pointy end of succession. And I think the starting point for our family has been, we lost half our family farm 10 years ago and we had to sell it for financial restructuring reasons, and witnessed sort of how quickly ecological momentum can be lost when it comes under different management. And in recent years we've been able to regain access to the management of that country, and it's caused all our family to step back and think, well, what's the point of us doing this for another generation if very quickly that can all be undone if again that land gets sold. And so it's prompted some very deep thinking around legacy and protection of land in perpetuity, but also a thinking beyond our family, thinking at sort of a community level and a human level of this strange recent notion of land ownership, which if you look at the long arc of human history is really a very recent phenomenon. And I think it's been sort of layered on top of various experiences and work that I've been doing for the last few years, where I've sort of seen the really pointy end of that way of thinking and that ideology that we hold in Western agriculture. And I guess just to give a few examples of that, I spent a few years working in the peri-urban region of Melbourne, where some of our most productive farmland is being paved over by suburbs, and I'd be standing with a farmer in their paddock looking, and they were pointing to me across the hill at orchards that their grandfather had previously managed but was now completely taken over by suburbia. And they had this sense of inevitability and helplessness that was going to happen to their farm because there was no sort of legal or policy mechanisms to protect it that valued the right of that land itself to survive. And around that time I was doing some research with Young Farmers Connect and Farmer Incubator, looking at the key barriers that are facing our next generation of farmers. We did a nationwide survey and interviews right across the country, and it came through that the number one issue, which wasn't a surprise, is access to land. And I remember doing an interview with this incredible young farming couple on the south coast of New South Wales who were producing food and were really valued by their community and part of that community. And they said to me, it would take 400 years for us to pay for land if we bought it here. And they had no secure pathway to land access in that community that so desperately wanted them there. And following those experiences, I spent some time working and living up in remote Indigenous communities in the Tanami around Tennant Creek. And our family was also then starting to form some relationships with a senior Garigo lawman at home, and really facing into these deeper questions around reconciliation and land justice and reparations as colonised farmers on stolen country. And I think for me, having walked country with elders and knowledge holders and felt the sovereignty and deep belonging and reciprocity that's undeniable once you feel that, it then started me really questioning this whole history of agriculture and colonisation on this continent, and the legal fiction of terra nullius that justified the invasion, that this land belonged to no one and therefore it was all for the taking. And if I then sort of zoom out and look at how that logic has been applied globally, it's got us to a point today where land inequality is so vast that 70% of the world's farmland is owned by 1% of our farmers. We have this sort of increasing pace of what's been called land grabs by foreign investment and large corporate agribusiness, that's also being driven more and more by the carbon and biodiversity markets, which means that we have these powers with the political influence to change national government law and completely ride over any Indigenous smallholder, family farmers, right to country. We have that happening as well from the mining and resource industry as well. And so with all of that context, as we step back in as a family to the succession process, and it's been coming up a lot with other families that we farm and walk alongside, many of whom are in this room, I started to see this complete mismatch between this legal system and notion that we have of ownership and private land ownership, and the way that so many of us feel about the country that we are privileged to walk over. There's a much more entangled, reciprocal and relational sense of country. It's not so much a sense of ownership, and yet we have this legal system when you get to this point of succession and looking at this intergenerational transfer of ownership that immediately takes us back into this transactional language that splits families apart and damages land and doesn't even reference the sovereignty of the people who stewarded it for tens of thousands of years. So that's the sort of tangled knot that we're facing into right now.
Can I ask where you're at?
So where we're at as a family is we reached a pretty high point of kind of tension and helplessness working within the existing legal framework. And then we're lucky enough to encounter Jim Phillipson to my right, who he came to the table and he was able to listen up from mum and dad in particular, this deeper sense that they had around this land is not an asset that is to be inherited by the next generation that can then be sold on or cashed in, or that there's a much deeper sense of belonging here, and there's a much deeper sense of responsibility and spiritual obligation as well. And he sort of, because he stepped outside the conventional legal processes of succession, he was both able to give them the space to articulate that, but then also bring to the table these different ways of working through succession that looks at commons and land ownership and First Nations land justice and things that felt much more in tune with our family that at that point we didn't even know were possible.
I'll rest my case. I don't have to say anything now. No, really the challenge is to not see the knot, so that the knot is easy to undo. And that's where I've been fortunate, living in both worlds, speaking both languages. And to me it's very simple and fundamental, that it's the country first, land first, people second. We've all got a responsibility for future generations to absolutely respect, protect, enhance and pass on that land in a better condition. There's no way known that a corporate with their primary mantra as shareholder profit will do that. So clearly the people that steward the land, love the land, live on the land, are the ones that are to decide the future of that land. In our particular case, we're all of our land, if you like, we've born with nothing and we'll leave with nothing. That's the ultimate legacy. It's not an accumulation legacy. So we're already in train with transitioning our land to the commons. Now that doesn't always suit everybody. But because I've worked across the whole spectrum of full commercial succession planning through to fully reciprocal, then it's easy to start to work through that process. And talking to peri-urban, just last week I was out on a multi-generational, you'd say old sheep country. Phil will know this area pretty well, Basalt Plain, Earless Dragon, and that property was about to be steamrolled by peri-urban subdivision. So within an afternoon we scoped out a plan that enabled the protection of certain areas of the property for perpetuity, certain areas for the family to remain on the property, and certain areas that were least suitable for those two to be allowed to be subdivided. So that was and that's a conceptual. Clearly, in a couple of hours, you can't solve all the problems of the world, but it was a weight off that family's shoulders, and really coming in externally, and it's not just something that's inherent in what I do. It's really engaging a genuine external person that will be more listening than telling, and start to reflect that family's needs. But if we start with the respect for the land, the family farming unit can't get any smaller. In many cases, we're subscale anyway. So the opportunity really is to start to work together as families across the landscape. Rather than the last generation, we've probably been a bit more acquisitive than is healthy. So we see a whole demographic of landholders, 70 to 90 years old, and the time is now. We say they've got the keys to the future. They're standing at the edge of the cliff. They can jump off, and all the next generations lose that land. And it was really interesting. A couple of years ago, I was in the Solomons in very, very remote island that was being attacked by Malaysian loggers. And they were seducing family by family with really a few packets of cigarettes and bags of rice for this beautiful old growth forest. So without speaking any of the language, we had a meeting at the top of the mountain with all the chiefs, and it's very much a family system. So there's a dozen families across this magnificent landscape. And they were arguing, or starting with the premise that they had to take the money so they could educate their kids. By flipping that around, that their legacy was actually in the land, and the continuity and their responsibility was to protect that, and the money was secondary. And it was an act of faith, and I said, have trust the world that this is a precious part of the world, and that will provide. And last year I got a call that World Bank had totally funded their entire community, far more than the logging ever would have, to actually protect that entire environment. So I think we can't be too reductionist in our thinking. We need to trust our gut, have faith, and the next generation will solve those problems, but we've got to give them the chance and the opportunity to protect that inheritance that is their right for them and their kids after that.
Wow. How fascinating and how wonderful, all three of those. Yeah, thank you. I think that's so interesting, because I think one of the dynamics that drives so much of this transferal of sovereignty, if you like, is what you just described, which is, people come in and it's a bit like a colonising force. They come in and they say, well, we're going to improve things. This is going to be good for you. It's going to be better for your future. Your kids need to go off and they need to get educated at university, and we are not valuing what it is that we stand on what we live from, what we come from, and as you say, it's a flipping. But that flipping is an incredibly difficult thing to do. I think we've become so, habituated against doing that now. It's also forward, it's also expansionist. So it's carving new behavioural paths for all of us, I think. Can I hold you a little bit, Jim? I'm interested to know a little bit more about the actual mechanism that you've used in your family, because I understand that you've disinherited your children.
It's an interesting one, but yes, our children have already inherited, if you like, they're both nearly 40, and they've had a great, well, I shouldn't say had a great, they are a great life, great people, and great part of our family. But they recognise, as we do, that continuing to have land within the private system means that after they're gone, or after their kids are gone, or whenever the chain breaks, which it always does, then inevitably that land will tip into the danger of extraction, particularly the properties that we love. So they're perhaps on the balance sheet being disinherited, but in reality they'll remain as stewards, as we will, for as long as we can and choose. They'll dig our final 2 holes, and so that's part of the system is really having that land in a secure, neutral entity. We're not prescriptive as long as that's not able to be divided and extracted. So it's a protected entity, and that can range right across from pure commercial to pure not-for-profit. And yes, they'll enjoy that. They'll contribute as much or as little, but that entity will effectively be governed with a board that is responsible for ensuring its continuity, its protection, and that's the way we're starting to operate right across Australia with different properties. We've got a great story talking of disinheritance. There's a 15-year-old lad from New South Wales that's just inherited a whole forest. So that's not in his name, but it's in his life.
Can you talk about, that's a beautiful story. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, this again, South Coast New South Wales is becoming peri-urban, particularly for Canberrans moving down there. And you've just got this wonderful old growth coastal forest. And generally that's been owned by somebody that bought that in 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago for a couple of dollars an acre. And it's now worth $1 million an acre. So that's been sliced and diced, and then it's a ride-on mower paradise. So there's a 70, 80 acre remnant of 1,000-year-old trees, greater gliders. And so this young fella, he was going in there photographing the greater gliders, and then he discovered that there was a survey peg, and he went home. He was really distressed. And property was owned by a 96-year-old woman, and so she decided to subdivide and sell. Fortunately, he then activated the community. So his mother got around, people started talking, and really literally surrounded by residential. So this is a real haven. And so they reached out to ANU, David Lindemeyer, a whole lot of other people, and a nearby couple then reached out to me and said, "What do we do?" That's the usual call, and so I went through what we do, and raised the funds, and they said, "No, I don't think we'll be able to do that. We'll pay for it." So it took us 6 months because it was pre-subdivision. But once we had that back in, we were able to negotiate that purchase into a commons. And that's now going through covenant under New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust. And we call it Ned's Forest because it's Ned's. Ned's now 17. And that's been so inspiring for all the Neds in the world. You don't have to grow up and earn $1 million and then give a bit at the end of your life. It's if you commit, the world will help.
That's a great story. So I guess one of the questions, and this feeds into the conversation we were having yesterday about mental health too, because, you know, so many of the problems that I think farmers have are around how do I hold this thing and how do I negotiate where this thing goes, and what does it mean to own land. And as you said, Tanya, you know, this idea of land boundaries are so arbitrary anyway, particularly if you consider the history of the land. And we know that nature doesn't see land boundaries, you know, hyphae and roots, and I mean, they don't understand these arbitrary divisions. But I guess I'm interested also to know, these ideas are basically, your work, Jim, is based on the idea that what's the way forward in each individual case if we prioritise the health and well-being of the land. If the land comes first and we see ourselves as stewards, what's the solution in every case? How do people around you respond to that? I mean, you guys are all working on the land. How do other farmers respond to that? What's the kind of response, and how do you get people to think more broadly about these issues? You three are mavericks or groundbreakers because you're doing this work, but others aren't there yet. How do you get people there? I mean, in your case, I mean, you know, you in our previous conversation, you were giving me some stats. You were talking about this idea of the way, you know, when Indigenous land is handed over, it goes into a corporation, and not a corporation, corporation, and then there's that the process of succession within that is really complex. And then there's the fact that I think you said that Indigenous people hold 60% of Australia, but in the National Farmers Federation document regarding sustainability, they are a subsection of subsection to gender diversity in the NFF roadmap, which is kind of crazy. So how do we start to progress these ideas within the broader community? That's a big question, but have a shot.
So I'd say we need to start with the land, and it's the constant in all this, that it's nurtured us for such a long period of time, and it's our responsibility to keep nurturing back for the next however long is needed. So I often think the landscape is the most important part, and not just the 4 boundaries that you have on your fence around your property. I mean, the broader landscape and the way in which that interacts with the whole natural environment. And I think the intersection of that, if you truly appreciate your landscape from an Indigenous perspective and understand the boundaries, and you recognise the respect that other mob have in their own different countries, the interplay between nations is so powerful that if you can think that whatever you're doing on your land is the right thing, whatever you're doing within your ecosystem is the right thing, and that everybody else in your community and the nation, I guess more broadly, will start to adopt those practices as well, then that's where the hope and aspiration comes from. So for me, that there's a real way in which we can start working through that. I think there's a lot of opportunity when we think about the change that's going to happen over the next, say, 40 years is going to be pretty phenomenal. So Indigenous land holdings are going to increase to about 75%, but we actually probably can't do much on that land because it's going to be native title, and pastoral rights go over the top of that and mean that you can't probably use it for the purposes that we want. However, we also know, the average age of a farmer is 56, 58 here in Australia, and that's going to create a whole new demographic of young people coming in and really challenging some of the norms around what agriculture is and how we practice it and Well, it should. So I think that convergence of all that happening, part of it is just riding the wave and just waiting out, knowing that the landscape's going to be here and that it's our responsibility to keep giving back and feeding the opportunities, that waiting for the right moment.
We also know that there's a lot of resistance, isn't there, to those sorts of ideas. You know, this is my land, I do what I like on my land, these are my boundaries. Do you think that those ideas are legacy ideas, and increasingly there's a shift because of the external pressures? You know, we have a crisis, an environmental crisis, a social crisis. Do you think those things will force change, or, you know, people only change when they have to? Is that too negative?
Yeah. Gosh, my head's gone to a few different places. I think a few years ago I was working with the refugee and migrant communities in that peri-urban region of Melbourne, and there was a matriarch of the Liberian community who'd been really driving for her people to get access to land. She was from a farming background, and they were facing all kinds of issues around accessing culturally appropriate food. And there was this day we had on a farm where they were able to gain access and start farming their crops, where she just let out this shriek and started dancing, and she had state MPs and state old dairy farmers and people in suits just sort of breaking down in dance with her, because her joy was so infectious to be back on country and to be able to be producing food for her people. And the sort of infectious joy of that sense of integrity and being in right relationship to country has stayed with me ever since, because of, I think, yes, there's this sort of resistance, and I think this brittleness that we have held in Australian identity for a while that hasn't been able to countenance the fact that our belonging to place doesn't need to cancel out someone else's belonging, and doesn't need to pave over Indigenous history, that actually, you know, as humans we all have this deep ancestral belonging to Earth itself. And so I think there's a deep knowing in all of us of the truth of that, and there's an infectious joy and rightness to that. And I think if we hold the conversations in that vein, a lot of the resistance takes care of itself.
I think with every challenge there's an opportunity, and certainly if we're going through a cycle where we work to optimise that, call it the right way succession planning, but every day today there's land going to corporate. But what we do know is that corporate's got a short shelf life. So on average, most of that corporate land will be flipped in 7 years. Now, it will not be the land it was when they started, because their profit and loss reflects the natural extraction. But nevertheless, the integrity of that land is there. So I think working together as a community, and as we say, taking the long view, always having that clear vision, but be ready to act tomorrow or today. So that's the positivity. I know Tanya's place is surrounded by people that are ripping up that environment, and it's hard work to drive through that and get to the oasis of Seven Park. But with the experience of people like the Haggertys, we know that land can come back within a decade of kinder stewardship. So I think we simply imbue and trust next generation to be able to carry that out.
Yes, I have to say that I can understand, and maybe my concern about how quickly we shift people's perspectives comes also from the fact that we've spent a lot of time visiting the farms of the people we work with, and they are those oases, and they are surrounded by these, intransigent value systems and practices that seem to be so close to the proof that flourishes on their boundaries of another way of thinking, another way of being, another way of doing, and the joy that's available there. You know, we heard Chris Eggerts talking yesterday about the joy he feels when he puts his hand into his soil and he feels overwhelmed with it. You know, that's there for these people to access, but they don't seem to. And I have to say, I also, at the other end of the spectrum, when I deal with my customers, because I work in retail, I see the joy that they get from consuming the products that come from farms, which are where land is put first. So I think that's really important to say as well, because this is a cycle, you know, and it's a feedback loop. I think there's probably quite a lot of questions in the audience, because I think a lot of people are dealing with these issues. So I think at this point we might actually throw it out to questions to see if we can extract some more out of these wonderful people. Who would like to ask a question? You've got a question? Extract. I shouldn't use that language. I'm sorry. Thank you. Tease out. Seduce. What would you...
I'd just like to ask about, lots of people have a fear of this kind of lock-up in perpetuity, meaning that we won't produce food on it anymore, and how we are communicating that we want productive abundance from this landscape. It's not all to just be not managed, you know, it's not exclude humans, but it's hold the land in a different way.
Are you talking about rewilding, that sort of idea?
No, I'm just talking about this whole concept of if we don't use the traditional hand the land to the next generation, slice it up, divide it by the number of kids, there's their little bit each, off you go, they then get to produce whatever they want with them. If we have a different concept, lots of people perhaps see that as we've locked the land up, so it's no longer allowed to be used to produce food.
Okay. So the question is, if we pursue a different path from the conventional hand it on to your children, there's a question about the capacity for that land to produce food. Who'd like to take that question?
Thanks, Kate. I think what politics is very good at doing is picking a maximum of 3-word slogans. So this lock it up and lose it, or whatever is a fear tactic, but it's protecting the food security of the community, literally. So if the community prioritises food production, then that's what it is. Whereas if it is in corporate, private or government hands, it's more likely to be lost to food production. Because under our current system, food production is a low return on investment. Unfortunately, we don't seem to value food. So it's more likely to go into some form of other use outside of community ownership. But the constitution of that governance is what determines the stewardship of that land. But I think we're seeing a massive hollowing out of rural communities, some of which we've created ourselves in aspiration of sending kids to uni, knowing they won't come back, but also in not having a viable local economy. So Bega is doing a good job of actually having that circular economy and keeping production intact in Bega Valley. But all around the world, I mean, the commons has always been the way. But it's not necessarily, we need to be a bit lateral. It's not a total commons. It's a version, it's a hybrid. It's a hybrid that's better than where we are now. And that's the art in the science of designing it. But definitely the language is really, really important. We need to be positive. We need not to go into the negativity, and that was one of the rules of Matthew's. Every session had to end on a positive, but it's much more aspirational. We know that to have a productive unit, a scale, if you like, we can't cut it up, and simply the traditional hand it down to the kids is creating so much pain. Every day we just see just bitterness and permanent division between siblings for no reason other than they think there's always a one sibling that will if you like stand out. So currently it's not a good system. So we can do a lot better and learn from 60,000 years. I mean, no system's perfect, but we've been blessed with the inheritance of the longest running, most viable, most resilient system that humanity's ever known. So to spit in the face of that is just self-destructive.
Yes. Yeah.
In my farm, we've put in place a model where we've put it into the commons. And one of the key problems that needs to be solved is how you fund the retirement of the older generation. And so in our context, we had the option of, well, Mum basically sold a third of the farm to do that. But what are some options where farmers don't have that option of selling some of the land to free up capital? Like, what are some actual models where you can bring in capital to work, make the commons thing work? Yeah.
So the question is, if you do put a commons model in place, how do you fund for the generational transitions? How do you fund for people who want to exit the farm, the older people? So before we answer that question, we're going to quickly define the commons model.
Yeah, there's not a common model for the commons, but it's essentially a non-personal asset would be the simplest. So it can still be very tightly held. In other words, a commons it doesn't have a shareholder, so you can't extract. So no individual can benefit from that. But the members of the commons determine the future of the commons. So that can be the family members. So in other words, you'd call it, say, a family commons. Perhaps that's an extreme use of the word commons, but it's common for that family. But that would preserve the farming asset for future generations so that next gen can live and steward and so forth, but not extract. And that's the important thing. But I'll hand over to Tans to answer one of the little, because this is a major, because partly we're living now with 4 generations or even 5, whereas formerly we had 3, and Mum and Dad would have shuffled off when they're 60, but that's not happening anymore. So we've actually got a smaller version, if you like, a local version of what's happening in the world, with less and less younger people having to basically care for more and more older people.
I was hoping you'd keep going, Jim. Great question, Rennie. I think, so I'll talk to a few different points. So the way our family has come at this is we've been able to work with a group of wonderful people who are investors, but also really deeply care about the land, and they have partnered with us to come in and purchase half the family farm that we lost. And we're still sort of working out how that investment model works in terms of transitioning Mum and Dad out, but also in terms of how we return that capital. And the mechanism that we've landed on, which isn't perfect, but it is predicated around carbon and biodiversity income. And I think I have a lot of issues with that, this whole sort of capitalisation of nature in that way, but there is, if we use it well, there is some opportunities here to really provide pathways onto land and finance into farming families and communities and First Nations communities for land access, if we hold it carefully and come at it in the right way. So that's one way. If I look at what the agrarian commons have been doing in America, they've been able to work with communities and a national network of philanthropy and finance to raise money and purchase out the previous generation of farmers for, really high value land that needs protection and is in danger of development. And they run sort of national campaigns that's really informed by a local governance network. And Tammy, if she's in the audience with the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, they're sort of really looking at bringing that model to Australia. So she's a great person to tap on the shoulder if you're interested in that. And then in other nations like France, which is really grappling with the lack of access to land for the next generation of farmers and an ageing population, even more so than Australia, they have local government agencies that have been really stepping in to the fray and providing both the finance and the organisational support for transitioning farmland, purchasing it off older farmers and bringing younger farmers into the fray. So I think it's a whole of community effort. We need the private capital, we need the public capital, the philanthropy and investment, and some very, clever consideration of all these existing and emerging natural capital markets as well.
We've probably got time for one more question.
Okay, just got a quick one. So we were at a session last week that there were a couple of young farmers, it was all about succession, a couple of young farmers come up to me and said, the image of being a farmer based on previous doesn't sit with this. It's a bit like the Great Australian Dream to own your own house. There's sort of got this image attached to it. Could Tammy or Josh speak to how you're seeing that image disappear? As in the idea of ownership, which is fiction anyway. Yeah, but that idea that young farmers want to follow in their farms with this ownership question. How can we make that more enabling and more noble to actually have this custodianship?
So how do we help young farmers to see a future without that ownership model? Yeah.
So I think there's probably a few parts to that. So the first one is just getting young farmers involved generally. And I think why there is a more interest in young farmers pushing regen systems is because regen systems actually show young people in the fields rather than the conventional agricultural system that shows old white guys, roaming fields and thinking that's the agricultural model that we should go down. I've got a little bit of a chip, but I think there's also a model around Indigenous farmers, and one example I always use because it's so obvious is the National Farmers Federation put a picture on the front cover of their thing around Indigenous involvement in agriculture, and it had a cow on the front cover. So if we can't see people involved in these systems, we're not going to get people to actively be engaged. So I think that's been a huge opportunity for Regen because it's pushing that model of saying actually young people are leading this, and they're involved. And we also have this massive, eldership of people to learn from as well. So it's that, I think a really interesting model. In terms of farm ownership, I think even in terms of home ownership, I think has been, hitting the news every day. So the pathways in are important. We need to celebrate the success of where people have used, innovative models to try and get onto the land. And we need to start shouting those from the rooftops to say, this is the model, this is how it's worked, this is how succession's worked. We actually just need to be a bit more, we need to open up those conversations so that people can see it, I guess, and really just be a bit more transparent around that.
I'm not sure there's much more to say, but I think, cracking question, Rob. What's coming up for me is, I think, if I think of the way that my parents, and I'm looking at Diane, Ian Haggerty in the audience, and Christy Stewart here, who's and other families that we've walked alongside for the last few years in very similar places, there's always often this sense in farming families that this land isn't ours, and it is actually a responsibility we have for the broader community anyway, and that there is this sense of sort of refuge and sanctuary that increasingly urbanised population is so hungry for. And so it very much feels already like there is this sort of common shared resource that, okay, we are privileged enough to live there, but it is not ours, it is for everyone. And I feel like so many of my peers that I'm farming alongside are already stepping into that image, and that has been modelled to us from the elders that have come before. It's not just unique to our generation, but it does feel like with the pressures that are facing modern households and young families and cost of living and things, it's becoming more and more important, and it's more and more front of mind. But I also think it also speaks to what I touched on at the start, that we all have this really deep need to belong and to feel home somewhere, and I think that again is the power of agriculture and farms, and done in the right ways, that it offers that sense of belonging that is not exclusive.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but as you can see, there's a great wealth of knowledge and understanding here, which you should mine, extract as you outside the tent. So thank you so much, everybody, and please thank our panel.